Okay, welcome everybody. I know we've got a few people that are still joining us, but I wanted to welcome everybody to this consultation of the 2023 GEM Report on Technology and Education. So this consultation is hosted by the Comparative Education and International Development Research Group and the Center for Research in Digital Education, both housed at the University of Edinburgh. So my name is Will Smith. I'm the coordinator of the CEID Research Group. And I'll be chairing today's event. Really excited to have all of you join us today. Before we get started, a couple of reminders. Please do use the chat to introduce yourself. We've got people coming from all over. And so really excited to be here. Ensure that your camera is off and your microphone's muted. We do have some support behind the scenes to make sure that this goes smoothly, but help us with that by making sure that your camera's off and microphone's muted until we get to the open discussion, and then we're happy to see you and hear you. The event is being recorded and it will be shared publicly. It's a great way for the GEM report to continue to reflect on this conversation as I go forward with this report. And as I said, we're going to actually get started right now. So this is the consultation phase for the 2023 GEM report on technology and education. And we're really excited to host this with the GEM report because it's the key moment to input into their early thinking on this report. So the process of the GEM report really starts with the think piece. And I think we're actually expecting to have the think piece author, Mary Burns, join us today. So that'd be great. That think piece leads into a concept note written by the GEM report team, and then they have open consultations based around that concept note. And that's the stage we're at today. There are multiple ways you can input into the GEM report consultation. There's an asynchronous online consultation which is still open. And we'll add that to the chat in a bit, where you can continue to have conversations, you can continue to share resources with the GEM report team online. And they're doing a series of live synchronous consultations like today with experts to get input, share resources and insights, and continue to ask questions that will shape the report going forward. Today's agenda, we're really excited to have the director of the GEM report, Manos Antoninis, share out on the concept note. As you can see in the top right, that concept note is available. You saw it with the Eventbrite invite. So we're excited to have him share out. We also have many other GEM report team members here today. So welcome to the rest of the GEM report team as well. This consultation came about in part due to a response from the CEID research group and the Center for Research in Digital Education, providing a joint response to that concept note. And I'm excited to have three of the authors from that joint response here today, Michael Gallagher, Jun Shu, and Ben Williamson join us, and they'll be giving a quick panel response to the concept note following Manos's presentation. And then we'll have hopefully a good 45-50 minutes for an open discussion. As we are thinking about what are some of the things that might be useful inputting into the GEM report at this point, at the end of the concept note, they ask 5 different questions, saying here's some of our next steps. So when you're listening to the presentation on the concept note and thinking about your own work and the panel, please do also think about these general areas, which include the role of technology in addressing education challenges around access, equity, inclusion, so forth. What do we know about potential negative impacts of technology onto some of these challenges? How do countries facilitate access to technology for equity purposes? How do systems embed the use of technology within the system, including curricula, learning materials, and support for teachers, which obviously we see as increasingly important during the pandemic? And how can the negative consequences be addressed? So there may be negative consequences. How do we actually overcome some of these? So just keep those questions in mind. We'll come back to them for the open discussion. You've been invited here because you're an expert in this field, and we're looking forward to really hearing your research, your resources, your insights during the open discussion. So without further ado, I want to invite Manos up. I'm going to stop sharing my screen to share on the concept note. So Manos, thanks so much for joining us today, and it is over to you.
Thank you, Will, and thank you all for organizing this session. We really appreciate your commitments, your interest in our work. And as Will just said, most of you are experts in this field, and what you may often not realize is that the GEM report team does not consist of experts, but of journalists who try to learn very, very quickly in a very short period of time, and can only do that thanks to your support and engagement. So I have to apologize in advance because I will not be able to join till the end of today's meeting. I'll try to stay as much as I can, but I have a conflicting responsibility that it was not possible to change, which came unfortunately after this meeting. But I'll have the chance to present to you the core parts of the concept note, with apologies for those of you who may already be familiar, Mary included, who is actually up in the middle of the night, I suspect, which I really appreciate. And then we'll be able to listen to the core feedback. So starting with the screen, for those of you who may some of you not know enough about the report, just a quick word to remind you that this year we're actually celebrating our 20th anniversary as an editorial independent team based at UNESCO and published by UNESCO. And we have a twin mandate, which was essentially formalized in 2015 at the World Education Forum to do two things: to monitor, that's why we have the coverage of the SDG 4 targets, but also other targets in the SDGs that relate to education. And then secondly, we have a theme, which is selected by our advisory board, and it is selected out of the framework for action, which is the foundation document of the implementation of SDG 4, and calls on the report to report on the strategies that are being carried out, and to help through that hold all relevant partners to account for their commitment. So some of you are quite familiar with the themes we have covered. Our report comes about every 15 to 18 months. And we just recently launched in December, in fact, our latest report on the role of non-state actors in education. And we had a very engaging consultation also at the beginning of that process, which we're grateful for. And our next report on technology, which to some extent overlaps in the sense that many of the technology providers are non-state actors, and that was quite relevant, but we didn't cover that aspect so much in our last report because we knew that was coming up. So the report is due in the second quarter of next year. And we already know, because some of you are not always familiar, already know what the theme of the report in 2024 is going to be. And that is the leadership in education, covering all levels from the school all the way up to the ministry. So the concept note is, as Will said, the foundation document for us. It encapsulates our initial thinking and understanding of how we're going to approach the subject. It was informed by Mary's think piece, and it covers a broad range of issues to start with, reminds the readers of how SDG 4 refers to technology, especially in the framework for action. It conceives of technology as 5 different things: as infrastructure, as method of teaching and learning, as subject in which learners are engaged, as planning tool, or as a tool for planning and monitoring education systems, and as the backdrop to so much that involves our social and cultural lives, and therefore also education, given that it is a social endeavor. It has become to the fore even more after the COVID-19 pandemic, although the advisory board selected this topic even before this particular crisis. And it involves challenges particularly because of the divides between those who believe strongly in the potential of technology to provide solutions in education, and those who are more skeptical and tend to see education as a timeless process, which somehow its fundamentals may not have been so much affected by technology. And we have, of course, a major challenge for a report of our kind, which tends to be rooted in the present, in the recent past, and not to be very forward-looking or oriented, to be confronted by the one topic that is changing every day. So that is a challenge in the sense that we don't want to capture the cutting edge opportunities that technology may be offering, but more about how countries deal with the challenges of today. But that is more made more difficult by the fact that research on technology in education is quite complicated. The way it's being carried out, how it varies by context, level of education, setting, type of technology, modality, version that is being tested, but most critically, by the fact that the providers of technology are often behind much of that research, which complicates the independence of the research process and makes it ever more complicated and difficult for governments, and of course for reports like us to see through the dust and the different voices that call in one or the other direction. Our approach is to ask, first of all, what are the general big education challenges, and then ask the question whether technology can help. So to try and put the education first and technology as a potential tool. And once the potential is highlighted and proven in through the research that exists and the research that we may commission, then to ask the question, what then are the minimum conditions for technology to fulfill that, to the potential of technology to be fulfilled in order to support education. A slight aside, the report also hopes, given how broadly it's usually conceived, to also look at technologies outside ICT. So not just EdTech, but also the extent to which energy, construction, or transport technologies, for instance, can help shape and improve education. But I suspect that will be less of the focus of the discussion today, and it will generally be a secondary focus overall in the report. So I described already the two parts of the report, and I will start with the education challenges. So the big question that needs to be at the front is, what is the education we want? And then ask the secondary question, can technology help? So we have identified four large education challenges. The first is the challenge of access, equity, and inclusion. And we have split that into different chapters. Each row you see here essentially corresponds to a chapter in the report. The first is the actual access to education, especially for those learners that are hard to reach. We'll start, of course, from the historic groups that technology helped, low-tech in particular, those who are living in remote and rural areas, as well then that these approaches helped learners who were displaced and the refugees, and that's another group that we are going to be looking at. Learners with disabilities is, of course, another focus. And to some extent, we will also be looking at issues related to age and time. A lot of learners today are approaching and accessing education thanks to technology, which otherwise would have been hard to reach because they wouldn't have the time because of their home conditions to do so. At the same time, some characteristics are also potentially negatively affected. The presence of technology can make, or at least has been documented to potentially create challenges in terms of gender considerations. So that's another dimension we'll be looking at. The second issue of access is not the how, but the what. Technology is, of course, praised for the potential it gives to people to access knowledge in a very low cost, all potential knowledge that is around. But of course, then the issue is, how is that content curated? How is it made available in as attractive and cheap formats as possible? How people are supported to select, given this incredible amount of information, and also how to ensure that there is still enough interest and attraction for people to invest in making that content available. So the constant challenges that we have in many other fields of incentives for people to deliver, but that's not excluding some potential beneficiaries. The second big question is quality in education, and we have again also in this case split it in two parts. First of all, the basic skills, essentially how technology helps particularly disadvantaged learners to achieve at least the minimum learning outcomes, those who may be disadvantaged due to their home conditions, who may not have enough support at home, and how teachers can use these tools. So here we're looking explicitly at evidence of how technology tools do help, or in fact, some cases disrupt classrooms. So, and there is also a possibility we may be looking at a few other skills that schools traditionally help impart beyond the basic reading, mathematics, science, etc. Other skills that can potentially be supported by technology. And then the second question is the digital skills, all those new skills that technology is essentially bringing to our lives. In this case, we are planning to use the European Commission's digital competencies framework, DigiComp, which offers quite a nice and broad-ranging set of descriptions for the skills that matter, skills related to media and information literacy, to digital content creation, skills related to safety, to collaboration, but also to problem solving. And we're going to be asking how education systems adjust to make sure that they are never staying behind, considering, of course, that a lot of these skills are also being developed outside traditional education and formal education systems. Then the third question is technology as a subject, as I described it before. Here we're turning our attention primarily to secondary and post-secondary education. Technology in the sense of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics is, of course, a big part of what education systems are supposed to teach. The question we have here is, how is that done? What are the challenges for education systems to keep up to speed? But also more critically, how is technology, how are governments in their national technology development strategies conceptualizing the role of the education system, and especially higher technical institutes and universities? Their role has been changing over time. But the question is, countries do need to import and adapt technology, but they also have aspirations for developing technology. What is the role of education in that part of our concerns? And then the fourth question is system management. How is technology being used to facilitate the analysis and use of data, with a particular interest in the case of learning assessment data, given the potential for really vastly expanding the capacity of governments to understand what is happening in the system, but of course with a lot of constraints given the demands that such data are putting on education policymakers and administrators. So with these potential impact of technology being established, then the question is, how can education systems ensure that this potential is fulfilled? The first question is access to technology. How can governments ensure that all learners have access to technology resources? Here, we're talking about equity considerations, but also more generally the system, how it is established, how governments decide where to invest, what sort of information do they have, how do they put it together, how do they ensure that they're not being pulled around by different providers and make the right decisions, and then how do they finance these decisions, how do they procure, and how do they maintain, because we also have a lot of white elephant projects in this field that drain resources from countries. So we'll be looking at policies that try to ensure that. And there's an overlap with the second question of governance and regulation, because of course decisions on education technology are not just the purview of ministries of education. They come from a broader set of government partners that decide on big infrastructure projects often. So how that intergovernmental coordination is taking place will be discussed, but then also how our broader issues of protecting learners from risks of technology are being regulated, and what is the legislation that exists. And finally, last but not least, teacher preparation. All that will be fine, but unless we are prepared to really properly support teachers to teach, be familiar, use, and deal with technology challenges in the classroom and outside, we're not going to be going anywhere. So this chapter will be covering this dimension. So that's enough for, I think, from me. Just a few reminders. Will also already suggested that our consultation has become much more flexible, thanks also to technology and the conditions under which we have been operating in the last 2 years. It is continuous, and we understand that it's really helpful for the team to be exposed to different perspectives over a longer period of time rather than to concentrate it. We had, though, already the call for expressions of interest for background papers, and we are in the process of contracting the offers that we found most attractive. But for those of you who are listening or have some last-minute ideas, feel free to approach us if you think there's an area that you now realize that you could have contributed but you didn't recognize in time. We will also have a set of country profiles on how countries approach technology in education. Anna, who will be staying till the end with you, along with many other colleagues, is taking care of this new addition to our peer website that we launched in 2020 and which keeps being expanded by the themes that we are adding. And finally, in our regional series, we plan to cover for this cycle the last 2 regions of the world that we have not covered in previous editions, but which also present specific interest for technology. That's Southeastern Asia and the Pacific. But this is over a period that will extend well into 2024. That brings me to an end, and thank you very much again for the invitation. We're looking forward to your feedback and ideas. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Manos, for sharing. Really excited to see so many different ways we can input into the report and the extension of peer. I know that's a newer part of the GEM report, and exciting to see that continue to be built out, especially for those that are looking for comparative policy examples. So I want to come back now. Actually, that's the wrong thing to share. The next thing we're going to do is go to our panel. If I can get this correct. There we go. So when the concept note came out, myself and others within the CEID research group and the Center for Research in Digital Education got together and formulated a joint response. We read through the concept note, and I am not by any means an expert in technology, but we have some great experts at the University of Edinburgh, including some you'll be hearing from very shortly. As we went through the response, we started thinking about some questions that may be missing from the concept note. So the concept note talks about, what education problems can technology address? And we just put that on the side. We said, okay, well, are there certain problems that are unable to be addressed by technology? Or for instance, a question like what conditions need to be met for technology to support education? And we went on the other side and said, well, what education problems might actually be exacerbated by technology? So in a second, I'm going to ask Michael to get up to help lead us through the response. I would encourage everybody in the audience, either responding from Manos, feel free to share resources, questions, insights in the chat. We'll also obviously have an open discussion when this panel is done. But as they come up, if you want to kind of park them in the chat for us to come back to, we're happy to do that. So with that being said, I want to invite Michael to come up. I'll be flipping slides for you, but I'm going to stop my video and mute myself. So Michael, come on up. And I'll move to the slide for you.
Yes, please. Thanks, Will. Yeah, just to reiterate what Will's talking about there too, if you do know of examples, some of the things that strike a chord that we talk about, and you know of more specific localized examples as well, please do share those in the chat. We can all learn from those, I think. So speaking of basically what our response in this panel will be around roughly these four these 4 points. Idea number 1 being technology cannot be seen as a solitary and instrumental actor in education, but an interdependent variable that brings with it questions around access and equity. And I think it's very important, and I think I'm probably not saying anything that you don't already know, is that to understand that technology is a complex system being dropped into an equally or more complex system when it comes to education. So treating it as a complex issue that has cascading impact on any number of issues, some of which are in 2, 3, and 4, is important to frame that. Without a consideration of that, I think it's fraught and prone to error. Number 2, technology engenders commercial imaginaries and that can amplify rather than mitigate educational colonial divides. June will be picking up on that a little bit, as will Ben. But the overall point there is that these technologies carry with them narratives of use, and they carry with them narratives of what education is meant to be and who is it meant to be for. So I think it's important to put those front and center when you're having these discussions. 3, technology can fail to account for and even amplify existing social stratification. I think that's probably not news to a lot of you, is that we do understand that. I think COVID certainly taught us that it more often than not reinforced these social dividers, these barriers to access, more than necessarily opening them up. But that's something we have to work towards as well. So as a tool for educational governance, technology limits policy landscapes and weakens existing institutional structures. It's very important to know how policy and technology interact and how they can potentially, without care or caution, they can potentially erode these localized educational contexts. So if you could, the next slide, please. Okay, so going back to the 2 questions that we had framed in response to the concept note, what educational problems are exacerbated by technology? You saw a rise, and again, this is probably familiar ground for many of you, but you saw a rise in response to these calls for technology and education to this idea of low-fee private schools, academies in a box, kits in a box, etc. And then this idea of market creation as well. And I think this is probably best typified by maybe to some degree, in an earlier example would be 1 laptop per child, but a little bit later on would be Bridge International Academies. These were low-cost private schools set up to run a very prescribed curricula in a very granular, very, very scripted pedagogical response with poorly trained, they were called learning facilitators, I believe, rather than teachers. This cascaded into the labor market, of course. This has implications for eroding the teaching as a profession in many of these spaces, and so much so that you're seeing many of these organizations there calling for an end to some of these practices. This probably peaked in around 2016, 17, 18, but it's still ongoing. It's still very much happening. In response to this idea of access, we're developing these low-fee private schools. So we can consider these kinds of schools, Bridge International Academies being maybe the most extreme, as being a little bit further down the road of what kinds of problems are potentially being exacerbated by technology. And that would be the teaching profession, I think, more than anything else in these localized spaces. We try the next one, Will? So what problems are unable to be addressed by technology? Well, rather than make this, be a little bit more optimistic in the response here, is that there are models that can help us here. It's just understanding the impact of each of these on the autonomy of local educational systems. And this includes, if you can see in the upper left-hand corner, this includes going as far down as OER, like not viewing open educational resources as strictly content, but they're vehicles for political and social concepts and curricula. And these are being exported largely, not always, but they're being exported largely from the global north to the global south. And it's problematic insofar as it's reinforcing some of those divides. But it's not without possibility. For example, the TESA India project there, about this idea of localizing, about empowering local, teachers within that localized context to create their own OER. We hope to see that as a trend going forward. The training the teachers part, which is the text a little bit off to the right there, training teachers in blended learning and partnerships, essentially, I would probably categorize the rest of these responses, is that there's really no shortcut for training teachers in this process, especially if technology is involved. That you can see there that teachers are even more likely to be even more central to learning and the adoption of ICT. With the adoption of ICT, so with the inclusion of ICT, teachers require and would be best facilitated by increased training, that the technology could be directed specifically, at least partly, at teacher training programs, and to build up and to offset some of the erosion of the profession that you might see in the other examples. Another example being PBL, the Pebble project in the upper right-hand corner about this partnership for enhanced blended learning. It's 8 universities in East Africa developing, co-developing shared courses that are made available as OER. You can download these courses now from OER Africa, which is a repository of content. And these sorts of approaches that involve partnerships are a little bit more sustainable in how they bring in technology into the equation. Other ones, it's controversial and it's problematic in many ways, but in the lower left-hand corner, this idea of public-private partnerships, working with commercial organizations to zero rate certain IP addresses and educational content. You saw this has been ongoing for quite a long time in some regions in the world, but basically it means that the mobile carriers or the telecoms waive the cost of accessing particular IP addresses or particular educational resources. Again, it's problematic in a few different ways, but that is an example of a public-private partnership that offsets one of the barriers that could potentially mitigate the use of technology in education. And another being Calibri, and I'm going to, my colleague JJ Miranda is on the call here with us, but this idea of the LMS, a learning management system that has offline, online connectivity, a fidelity to poor connectivity, essentially. So it can be made to run essentially offline. It can be made to run through routers that you have one laptop or device acting as a router for basically all the other devices within a particular distance, a proximal distance. So those kinds of models work much better, at least in our estimation, work much better in response to some of the challenges rather than these blanket kinds of uses of technology in education overall. And I think we're on to the next one, Bill. And I think I'm handing it over to June, who's going to talk about governance.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, so just as Michael has just mentioned, when we discuss about using technology to help address education challenges, it is important to regard it as an interdependent variable. Technology is not neutral and could be value-laden. So here are 2 lists of things what scholars believe what technology can do for education in the left column and what education cannot do for education in the right column. So scholars and policymakers would share diverse understandings of what role technology could play in education because of their different background, expertise area, and intercultural experiences. So this leads us to the first important concept I would like to introduce in the next slide, which is intercultural digital ethics. And the next slide, please. Yeah. So here, as what Agawa proposed, there's a question mark. How could we design a governance framework for intercultural digital ethics? If we look at the educational spaces, including the teaching and learning space, as well as the research context, digital technology does provide enormous opportunities and potentials to facilitate learning and education. But meanwhile, it is also raising digital ethics issues that are closely related to the equality and inclusion and the equality and the quality of education. So in the next slide, please. Scholars such as Gautam and Singh recommend to cast a critical relook at the current Western-centric ethical model and take a balanced intercultural ethical approach while understanding the impact of digital technology on education. So here in the right corner, there's an example that's given about the data and the privacy protection in China, but many countries in Global South are also sharing similar situations. This brings about crucial digital ethic issues for us to consider when optimizing technology for education globally as a whole concept. So this is the first concept, and the other topic that I would like to bring is about the global pressure and local pushbacks. The COVID-19 pandemic resulted in multidimensional challenges for education systems, and the rise of education technologies was seen as the go-to solution for crisis management. However, there are so many questions that in front of us. For example, what's the relationship between the economic instrumentalism of education and the mechanism of social stratification? Whether technology has helped to solve the problem of educational inequality or the divide in the social cultural context. Some scholars believe to a certain extent technology is exacerbating this phenomenon, and believe that there's the digital divide circle has been reinforced. And also scholars also propose concerns about the students' learning motivation in the online learning environment, as well as the students' well-being become very crucial topics nowadays. So on the other hand, there's also local pushbacks and resistance. Examples such as Chinese government has been taking some strategies to regulate the private capitals in the edtech sector. So although there may be larger questions in regard to the reasons that the Chinese government have been taking such precautionary measures to mitigate the influence of edtech, but the nature of the policy reforms suggests a concerted effort to regulate the platform capitalism. Thank you. I would then hand over to Ben.
Thank you, June. It's good to be here this morning. Welcome, everybody. So like Michael and June, my focus is perhaps more on the political and the economic aspects of technology in education. So that means taking a step back from problems or potentials of implementation in schools or in higher education to consider how various social, political and economic factors might shape or structure education technology development or diffusion or use. And one major, I think, factor that I just want to focus on for these few minutes this morning is investment in technology and education. As you can see from the graph at the top here, venture capital and other sources of private equity have been injecting billions into edtech, in particular over the last 2 years. But this is not, I want to suggest, and sort of, provoke some conversation about this afterwards. I think this is not just about investing in individual products, but it's about funding a transformational vision into being, into actuality. Now, this vision that investors are funding into being, and I would suggest, I'm sort of following some of the work by Janja Komljenovic here, who's also in the call, is a vision of data-rich education that involves AI, big data, and analytics. And of course, investments in all sorts of other things, but this, I think, is a core focus of much of the recent escalation in investment. So this is not just an investment in particular tech products, but arguably in forms of education, as Matthias de Cooper and colleagues have said. So ultimately, political choices are being made by investors about how education might, or indeed should be, and AI, analytics, machine learning, algorithms, and so on are seen as a core part of that. Could you flip to the next slide, please, Will? So these investor visions or imaginaries, I think, are already materializing in the shape of a vast and expanding market of platforms, of infrastructures, apps, and other things. So from the point of view of investors and ed tech companies, it seems like education can now be disaggregated into a whole variety of market segments, each of which can then be served by competitive providers, as I think this graphic at the top here indicates. So this is a kind of a vision of a very highly digitalized, data-rich education that is as much as possible embedded in and increasingly dependent upon ed tech. Now this raises some problems for ed tech itself, and one of those is issues of interoperability. Now, that is how to integrate all of these various platforms and services so that they can function together and in many cases exchange data between one another. So some might be learning management systems, might be student information systems, might be particular applications used in classrooms or lecture theatres and so on. How do these things function together? How does data move between one to the other and so on? And some examples of how these kinds of interoperability and integration issues are now sort of coming into the foreground might include Blackboard, the hugely popular global learning management system, which recently integrated with Anthology, which is an equally large student information system provider. And they're now developing cross-platform integrations to enable the generation of what they call greater student insights that can be then used for automated forms of personalized nudging to nudge students along to better outcomes. Google Classroom, we might see that as another instance where there's a huge emphasis on kind of integration. Google Classroom moved from being a platform used while schools were closed to repositioning itself as a learning management system now that schools have returned and being used in hundreds and thousands of schools. It's also added what it calls a marketplace of third-party add-ons. There's thousands of other apps and platforms that can be integrated into Google Classroom where the data is flowing through the Google system, all through a single Google sign-on. Just final slide, please. So I think what we can see is that initial investment in edtech platforms and increasingly the involvement of the very large global multinational companies like Google, Amazon Web Services is supporting a vision, or perhaps we might call it a logic of education, which seems to, in some respects, sort of presuppose that this edtech market is the most appropriate route to transformation, particularly in a post-COVID period. Now, this, of course, extends a much longer history of educational measurement for purposes like accountability and efficiency and so on. But it extends that now through new type of so-called AI and data capacities of not just performance-based accountability based on tests, but performance prediction based on real-time or near to real-time data traces, and even extends that further, according to Blackboard, amongst others, to preemptive decision-making and nudges towards optimized outcomes. This, at least, is the imaginary that's being projected. And in doing so, then, this would introduce increasingly opaque, hard to understand, proprietorial forms of automation and artificial intelligence into our education systems, which might to some extent function as technologies of governance, as Cal Golston, Sam Seller and Taylor Webb argue in their forthcoming book, Algorithms of Education. Now, these technologies might have powerful benefits. They may not work as promised at all. But currently, investors and industry are promoting and pursuing these kinds of technologies as part of this kind of vision of transformation. And I would argue that this report and this consultation exercise ought to take very seriously this kind of vision of where education, or how education should or might be. Okay, thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael, June, and Ben, for sharing just a few of the highlights from our joint response. In a second, we'll also share the link to the joint response in the chat box. I would encourage everybody, as we're getting ready to move to the open discussion, to continue to share resources in the chat box. These could be looking at great country examples, policies, financing, key data sets. These are just a way for the German Report to collect resources, insights that you all have as experts in the field, including your own work. So please don't feel shy to share some of your own excellent work in the chat box to make sure that they've able to gather everything from the chat box and include it in their report, investigation, and writing. So I want to come back now. We're going to go to open discussion, as I just mentioned. In the chat box, you can share insights, questions, resources. I'd also encourage you to raise your hand and just share out things as we move to the open discussion. You can respond to the concept note. This is a great spot for you to ask questions or bring up additional questions that you think maybe should be considered in this report. You can respond to the concept note, as I mentioned, anything that prompted you from Manos's presentation, anything from the panel, or coming back to these questions, thinking about, once again, the role of technology in addressing challenges, potential negative impacts, access, and ensuring that there's no gaps or real equity focus of technology, the use of technology within education systems, including curriculums, how can negative consequences be overcome, and then additionally, the two that we brought up from the panel, what educational problems might be unable to be addressed by technology, and what education problems are exacerbated by technology. So any of these questions, feel free to address, or anything else you'd like to. This is just entirely open discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and start looking for hands. I'm really excited to get this discussion going. So please do raise your hand, and I'm happy to go for it. So Manos, first hand up, go for it.
Just to acknowledge, given that I'm still here and before the questions start coming in, to thank the three of you for the feedback. Clearly, you know from having followed the report over the years that we are sympathetic to this perspective. I think Ben's work we had already also used in the accountability report. And maybe I think also I saw Dr. Komljenovich's research was quoted in the presentation, which I found very, very interesting. We quoted it in the last report, the 2021-22, especially the idea of the narrative and how I think text analysis of how all these providers present the issues is extremely informative and insightful. So, so we do think this is a very important perspective. The one question, though, that you also have to be aware, and maybe that would be one of my responses and for reflecting, is that the report covers the entire world, a very, very broad range of technologies and uses and applications of technology. The commentary focuses on one end. I think it's an extremely important perspective in the sense that it could be shaped, like describing the shape of things to come if we don't take the right measures. But do remember that we have quite a range of other contexts and uses to describe in our report. So all comments
Excellent.
are welcome.
Thank you
so much.
Yeah, so again, as you're thinking about examples, please do think globally. This is the universal report. So I want to now invite, we've got a lot of good hands up. So Felicitas, I know you've got to leave shortly. I'm going to invite you to come up and share. If you can introduce yourself when I invite you in, where you're from, and then if you're directing your question to somebody, please do let me know. So welcome.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Felicitas McGilchrist. I'm based at the Leibniz Institute for Educational Media and the University of Göttingen in Germany. And I've more of sort of a couple of comments rather than a question, maybe, which will contribute to more discussion. I'm afraid I have to leave early, like you said, Will. But I was thinking of 4 things as I was hearing the introduction to the GEM report and also the response from Edinburgh. I really appreciate the reframing of the questions and the new questions from the presentation from the Edinburgh team, which I think speak to really important like these political, economic, social factors which are beyond, outside of the classroom in itself. I think, yeah, 3 main things and 1 small comment. One thing is the socioeconomic context. A lot of the reports like this, the GEM report or other reports like this, haven't yet found a way to talk about the socioeconomic context of education. I think it seems like this is a thing someone else has to deal with, but I don't think we can think about technology and education without making explicit the socioeconomic context. And this is things like in Germany, different teachers earn different pay if they're at the elite school or all the way down the hierarchy of schools. And globally, we know that teachers in schools are differently financed if they're more elite or if they're more disadvantaged. And any use of technology has to be seen within that sort of socioeconomic context. And I would really welcome if someone could find a creative way to embed that into reports like this to make it more than a footnote, because it's something we all know already and it's always a footnote, but is there a way to make it more than a footnote? So that's one thing sort of on the meta level. The other thing is looking under the hood when we're looking at when we're looking at the inequality for access, the inequality of usage of technology. There's concepts like coded bias, which look under the hood of how technology is designed and for whom it's designed, with the view to whom it's designed, I think can be really useful for this sort of discussion as well, looking at the 4 questions that that you sent, Will, also in the email. One thing about teachers, I'm always wondering if the focus on supporting teachers to teach distracts from other ideas which are important in dealing with inequality in education around the world as well. Because when we focus on teachers technology digital competence, digital skills, etc. And I wonder if what they need more to deal with the questions that the GEM report wants to deal with is a justice competence or an equality competence, an equity competence, which gets buried underneath discussions of the technological competence of teachers when we're focusing on this and whether they can deal with hybrid or online offline contexts. Those are my 3 points. And I think one more point, there's various reports from UNESCO over the years on digital technology, and I wondered how much these reports are linked together to each other. I'll paste the one that I'm thinking of into the chat just now. Thanks very much for being able to participate today. It's really great to hear the input from the different teams.
Thanks, Felicitas. As I know you and I think Manos both need to leave very shortly, I'm going to see if there's any response from Manos or any of the panelists to the comments, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to start taking groups of 2 or 3 questions from here. But since Felicitas needs to leave in about 5 minutes, want to give a chance for a little bit of a dialogue. So Manos?
Just to respond to the last question, that the report is, as I explained, that's why I made that quick introduction, is hosted and published by UNESCO, but it need not have any relation with UNESCO output. It's a report to UNESCO, it's not a report of UNESCO. So in that sense, UNESCO publication is just another input for us. Inevitably, we're bound with UNESCO through the common shared belief in common principles of the right to education, and that's what is, I think, a distinct characteristic what it means to have the UNESCO brand and UNESCO logo on our reports. But in terms of planning, no, there is no such joint planning for any publications. But I would like to alert you that there is a very interesting report coming out from UNESCO in the coming months. It's been postponed for several months, but it's very much in the spirit of the commentary. It's going to be referring to the EdTech tragedy, at least that's the preliminary title, and asking essentially the questions that you have all been asking, which is in probably many people's minds, whether the COVID-19 pandemic has actually accelerated the move towards areas that nobody really wants, because technology was not meant to create or offer such solutions. So it will be a critical perspective on that. And an interesting one, considering that UNESCO has worked very closely with a lot of technology providers over the last 2 years. So it will be interesting to see how that sits next to other reports. But definitely reports that UNESCO has produced, such as those questioning the gender aspects of technology, will be, of course, also informing our work. Closing, I would like to say that on the socioeconomic side, I'd like to think that the report has been championing aspects of equity, and I think that was also what's made the distinctive dimension of our last report. So I would like to reassure you that this is how we would be addressing that and putting it at the center of the technology report as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Manas. So now I'm going to invite two people up. I'm just going to go in order. I see hands here. So I'm going to start with Tom and then Akansha. So Tom, why don't you go ahead and get started? Feel free to add insights or questions after you introduce yourself. So welcome, Tom.
Thanks so much. And thanks to all of the team for the presentation. Oh, sorry, my video is not working properly. There we are. Hi, as you can see from my background, I've still got it on from a previous meeting. I'm from the EdTech Hub. My role at the Hub is our global lead with, for country engagement, and that's working closely with governments around the world to think with them about how to effectively deploy education technology to meet the needs in the local environments. And I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but I want to thank the team for the presentation, because it's a good counterweight. I think it is really important to consider some of the challenges and really dig into them in depth. What I would say is I think we also face a lot of challenges with education as it is. So the ongoing approaches. So when you think about some of the topics you mentioned in terms of commercialization and privatization, the bigger firms becoming involved, we have similar but different challenges when we think about the production and distribution of textbooks across many countries. That's become a highly politicized and highly capitalized kind of process across countries around the world, where a lot of money is siphoned off into the private sector. And so I think we have some of these challenges in the existing systems of education. And I think building on what you've presented in today's session, I think we can use the lenses that you provided to both think about the challenges that we're facing as we think about how best to use technology to support learning for the most marginalized, but at the same time, as we think about how to best improve processes within existing systems going forward, whether they're tech enabled or not. So I think it's a really useful lens through which to think of how we move forward. We'll take away the report and the response, and thank you for sharing that in the chat as well, and consider that as we're starting to work closely with governments around the world. But yeah, thank you for the opportunity to hear your response and go into a little bit more depth.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Tom. So I'll give a chance for the GEM report to respond to anything they would like to say in a second, but first let's go to Akansha.
Hi, thank you so much, Will. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I had two questions which are interlinked. I am a senior research fellow with the EdTech Hub, so Tom's colleague as well. And my question is this, in all of what I saw in the presentation, as well as the sort of ideation for the forthcoming GEM report, what I find missing is assessment and socio-emotional learning. And the reason I bring these two in together is because I've been in the measurement area for the past decade, doing a lot of measurements around the socio-emotional learning aspect of education. One, we need to see beyond basics. And there's also some more research that I've done, which shows that definitely we need to be focusing on socio-emotional learning, particularly post-pandemic. And technology definitely provides a very significant turning point for measuring these skills, which so far have only been measured using traditional pen and paper methodologies. So thinking about bringing in elements of computer vision to, say, measure creativity. And combining these two areas is something that I feel it's a great turning point for us to start thinking about. And I wanted to hear from the panel on how we're thinking around this.
Excellent. So a couple of comments and a question. So I'm going to start with Manos. If you're still in the room, feel free to jump in, and then I will share this with the panel and see if they have anything they'd like to respond to. So Manos?
Could be my last intervention because I now need to go, but just to say that we do cover, I think I mentioned, just to Akanksha did mention that we are covering the aspect of assessment and how they can be used much more extensively, notwithstanding the risks that we heard in the commentary, but offering the potential for looking at the expanding horizons in understanding how learners learn. As often it happens with technology, it's a double-edged sword. It can be used for improving our understanding and helping improve the teaching process, but it can also be used to commercialize and to sell other tools, which is of course the downside. That's it's always very hard to track the right path through, but that is going to be covered. And as for the social and emotional learning in particular, not for assessment but as a skill, whether it helps, that's a bigger question. I did open a window, as I mentioned in our basic skills chapter, that beyond certain skills related to reading, mathematics, science, we might be looking at other aspects. We had in mind health education, how technology has been used in some aspects of health education is one potential parameter, but social and emotional learning is somewhat related, so it could potentially be covered there. But thanks for the suggestion. Tom, I'm not going to say much because we are collaborating with the EdTech Hub. So we have mapped areas in which our work overlaps, and we're definitely looking into this practical question of how these systems operate with an emphasis on governance, which is the one aspect we don't really know that much, how governments take decisions and are they taking reasonable decisions and they're not manipulated by the market or by basically non-pedagogical, non-education interests.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Manos. And our panelists, we've got any comments here on either the comment from EdTech or this question we've got from Akasha? So Ben, I see you popping up. Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, well, maybe just to comment very briefly back on the social and emotional learning. I know, particularly in the States, that this has become a huge political emphasis, and there's funding available in social and emotional learning, and actually it's become technologized and commercialized very, very rapidly through the advocacy of groups like CASEL and through funding from some of the major kind of technology philanthropists and so on. So I think it probably acts as a cautionary case of how quickly a seemingly an interesting and good area for us to focus on trying to understand better has already led to some technological innovations and suggestions which some of us might find quite problematic, which includes even ideas about automated AI-enabled facial action and emotion detection, which has even been promoted by the World Economic Forum in its report on social and emotional learning a few years ago. That's the kind of thing that I think risks being hugely controversial given the pushback against public facial recognition in other contexts. So I think there's probably a really fine line to be walked in a report like this, and acknowledging emerging areas like social and emotional learning and the possible importance of that, but the very rapid kind of technological overreach that's possible, and the real risks of capturing highly sensitive, very intimate, personal data about students, which goes far beyond the kinds of assessment and performance data we're currently collecting as well. So I think it's just about being cautious and acknowledging that actually that there is evidence already of social emotional learning becoming highly technical and being commercialized.
Thanks, Ben. I also see that Mary mentions in the chat box that her think piece addresses some social emotional learning. And if you haven't already, I would encourage you to take a look at the think piece. It's a massive piece, very detailed. Well done, Mary. So and feel free to jump in if you want to add anything else. So the next two I'm going to ask for are Janya and Laura. See both your hands up, and I think from the GEM report side, Anna, I think you're going to be taking over. So welcome, Anna. So yeah, Janya, welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me here. My name is Janja Komljenovic. I'm from Lancaster University. I read the concept note with great interest and also the response written by Edinburgh researchers. I very much agree with what was proposed there as well as what was presented here today. And I'm just going to build on that a little bit further. I'm going to be quite direct and utilitarian even, perhaps. So if you accept the proposed 5 distinct channels in the concept note, that is input, means of delivery, skill, tool for planning, and the context, then I'd propose at least 3 changes there. The first one is that a crucial aspect of input is not only hardware, such as the computers and internet connectivity, but also forms of education technology provision, such as digital platforms and applications, algorithms, and so on. And this matters very much because when it comes to governance of EdTech, it is crucial to think about what forms it comes in and who owns and controls education technology. Second, it seems to me that digital data and data-rich operations should get a more prominent and explicit role, so not somehow in the passing or hidden, probably in the input section as well as the context. So in EdTech, as in other sectors in the digital economy, digital data is central. And by this, I mean user-generated data, which is personal, but not only personal, and hence not regulated at all, but also other data collected from non-human things. So what matters here is who collects, controls, and uses this data, who gets to aggregate and run data-rich operations, who innovates with this data. And these are really crucial points, I think, might more directly address the kind of political economic aspects of EdTech that Felicitas already mentioned before. And when we think about the governance and EdTech, this is my third point, is that it's not only governance with technology and data, such as data for planning, which is now addressed in the concept note, but governance of technology and data. And at the moment, the innovation and operation of education technology, especially commercial one, is really black boxed. So there should be a strong political debate and commitment on governance of EdTech in the broadest sense. So then if we move to the section on what education problems can technology address, so if you look at the system perspective and the skills perspective, from the system perspective, what is addressed at the moment is managing with technology and not at all of technology. I mean, there are a few issues in the passing around privacy, but it's, first of all, I don't think that's the crucial point, and second of all, it's only in the passing. I quite like the work of Salome Viljoen, who is the American legal scholar, and she says that at the moment, digital data and privacy are understood either as a civil human right or as intellectual property. And in the first case, legislation like the GDPR is proposed. And in the second, ideas around financial compensation for user data are offered. But she argues that while these understandings are important, they really miss the key point of population control. And in data-rich operations, we as each individual are constantly put in relation to each other in search for patterns. So she argues that we should understand the collected and aggregated user data as a collective good with the need for democratic and relational governance. So in education, this would mean that students and staff should get an opportunity for a democratic and consequential discussion on what happens with their digital data, personal and other, how it is used for what, who accesses it, and so on. So the governance of EdTech should include transparency and participation in innovation too. So this is somehow connected to what Edinburgh group has already commented in their written response. And I think this really connects to the skills perspective, where it shouldn't be only about the digital literacy of kind of direct use of technology, but it should also include kind of informing and educating individuals and citizens to participate in such governance of education technology. So I would understand the digital skills a bit more broader than the EU definition. I would also like to emphasize the aspect of this system in terms that at the moment, it's incredibly uneven in terms of who innovates and where investments go. Mostly it's concentrated in US, China, some Western countries, but completely kind of missing out our countries of Latin America, Africa, and so on. So I think it's really important that the GEM report addresses this evenness in development as well of an innovation of education technology. And finally, my final comment is from the system perspective, is how EdTech operates and by whom. So the proprietary nature of most of the platforms should not be ignored. And this is what Ben has already addressed. I think we have learned very well from the global MOOCs what happened in time, that it started for free with really noble motivation. And now all global MOOC providers are for profit with payable services, while users have always been really from a more affluent backgrounds. So they have thus missed their initial mission, at least the global MOOCs. So when we think about how EdTech operates, we should recognize that the digital technology offerings come in forms of digital assets. And there is a need to discuss and find ways of governing these assets in a fair and redistributive manner. So I think if the governance kind of sections of the GEM report would include issues like this, we could make the kind of economic and political aspects far more central. Thanks very much.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Janka. I want to go to Laura, and then Anna, feel free to come in once Laura's given her questions.
If you want, I can wait to the next intervention and then answer to this concern that have been raised now. Okay.
Yeah, let's do one more. So Laura, come on in. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks very much. A few of the points that I wanted to raise have already been raised, so I will just focus on the ones that have not been raised. First of all, it's really good to see access, equity, and inclusion so foregrounded. I must say 5 years ago, there was still quite a lot of advocacy work happening for that to be taken seriously. And I think over the last few years, that's changed. Of course, what that immediately means is that people will push you further on those issues. And that's one of the things that I would like to do. But the first point I want to make is you've quite rightly asked, what can technology help with in terms of educational issues? And the team responses has pointed out that technology exacerbates existing problems. I would like to add a question, which is what problems does tech cause? And I think that I'm not being deterministic here, but I think we've actually seen that happen, especially during the pandemic. You've spoken about how this report is meant to be global in reach and audience, and certainly in some places it's caused a huge number of problems. So that's the one point. The second point I want to make is that I think it's really important to define and spell out what one means by technology. And I'm going to insert a very simple, perhaps very obvious little image into the chat. I don't know if you can read it. Anyway, it doesn't matter, I'll talk to it. And just a reminder that there's a whole lot of non-digital technology that we've seen being extremely relevant during this period. And it doesn't go away. It doesn't cease to be in existence. It doesn't cease to be necessary to plan for. So I'm talking about both paper and the like. Can you see the image? If it doesn't matter.
It's available. We just need to download it.
Okay, no, that's fine. But the point is, if we're talking about designing and policy for equity, we have to design for all ranges of technology. And I feel like the report focuses largely on networked digital technologies and ignores analog technologies and ignores non-network technologies. And even at a university, so I come from the University of Cape Town, which is, you know, the top university in Africa, etc. Even at a university like this one, during the early days of the lockdown, packs of paper were being sent out to students in rural areas. It is going to continue to be the kind of multimodality that's needed. It doesn't go away, and I think that has to be considered. I think that Ben has already spoken quite eloquently to the issue of smart technologies. So I won't talk about that, but my main point is that that technologies have to be differentiated, and there are some assumptions in the terminology. And then the last thing, I would like to push the issue of access, equity, and inclusion beyond inclusion to what Felicitas was touching on, which is around justice. And here I'm talking about parity of participation. And then there's a question about the role of technology in terms of epistemological access. And that's obviously linked to algorithms, to search engines, to North and South in terms of MOOCs and so on. It's a really big area, but I think it's an increasingly important one, and it might not cover a huge amount of space, but I think it's a bit of an omission. And that's what I mean about you start talking about access, and then you want more than access, you actually want full participation. So I think I'll leave it at those 3 points.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura and Janja. Anna, I'm going to go ahead and invite you to come in. There's lots to discuss, so feel free to pick out any points. We're going to have one more round of input.
So, okay, thanks a lot, Will, and thanks a lot for the comments raised. So indeed, there are quite a number. I will start by saying something that Manos has already said, but I would like to really highlight it again. The concept note is really something that we prepare to open discussion about the content of the report. So of course, it can give some partial view in the sense that it doesn't cover everything, but the plan is really to cover most of these issues in a way, and especially the big issues that are related to equity, quality, and inclusion, and broadly to SDG 14. So that's just to say, because many of the things that have been said, for instance, the fact that we need to go beyond infrastructure, of course, we will, there is, even if it is not explicit enough, this is the plan. And when we talk about access, equity and inclusion, we don't just focus on access and equity and inclusion for vulnerable groups, how technology enhance access for these groups, but is also the issue of content, how technology may make content cheaper and more available for different people, different groups, and going beyond the vulnerable groups. So yes, we take not only a global geographical focus scope, but also a broad scope of about the issues we are going to deal with. And so there was a mention of MOOC, there was a mention of open content. All this will be dealt, and especially in, as I was saying, there is a chapter that will be focused on access, equity, and inclusion, looking at how technology may enhance access for some vulnerable groups, but also looking at the challenges and barriers that technology may also create for these groups. And then there is a chapter that is more on access to content, looking at open educational resources at MOOC. And this, of course, we know that is impact on the life of different groups in different ways. It can impact on the mobility of students. It can impact on the people that work and need to be educated at different times of the day, of the year. So this is just one thing. The question of data is prominent in the report, because it will be dealt both in the chapter of the system management. System manager is really a lot about data, not only how technology can enhance the treatment of data, but also how this higher availability of data means in terms of privacy, safety, and then there is a two-part. So data can be seen as a part of the system development, but also as something that is very important in the issue of governance of regulation. So that's why it will be the treatment of data privacy, of ethical issues, of safety is very prominent on the report. And then also the issue of governance that was raised about the nature of proprietor, the nature of the proprietor of the platform will be, of course, dealt, because there is an issue there are some issues that have been even given a lot of importance during the COVID, and it's how the data that are, for example, accumulated by different entities can be used, what are the problems and the issues that are raising or will raise this kind of collection of data and their use, how it is possible for the countries, for the government, make sure that there are limits to the use of this data. So, and so this is impact also on the chapter of governance, on the kinds of partnership that exist, who is involved in the planning, in the vision for education technology. So how to make governance more participatory, more transparent, and how all our issues that will be taken into account. And of course, there will be much more that is coming. And there is, I hope that yes, there is one point that I want also to make with the peer, the profile enhancing education reviews on technology and education. We will also look in the terminology. So there was a question about, it's very important to define technology. And on this, I would like really to reassure you that technology is not just digital in our report. It will be everything that is technology. In fact, it can be low-tech initiative or high-tech initiatives. The issue of radio, television, or has been very important on the COVID side. And of course, this puts again at the center the issue of context. So the definition of technology, the low-tech, high-tech initiatives will be also covered in the report. And there is much more to come, but I will stop here, otherwise others will not have the time to make any comments. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, and I would encourage everybody to take a look at the document that Laura shared on the different types of technology and download that. So we're going to have one last bit of intervention. So in a second, I'm going to ask Patrick and Cristobal to share briefly our comments or questions. One final response from Anna, if necessary. Please do, as we're finishing up, add any specific examples, resources, research that you have to the chat box. And so Patrick, let's go ahead and start with you for our final round.
All right, thank you very much, Will, and thank you very much to all the panelists. This has been such an informative session, and I have learned a lot, and it also really pushed me into thinking about some of the things I personally consider when dealing with technology itself being introduced in our daily activities. One of the things I simply want to capture, and this has been captured by almost everybody, but because they've been thrown around, I think I should perhaps re-emphasize. This is on the debate in international development and how many of the themes that are coming up in this conversation are really touching on them. So for example, we are looking at private sector and we are looking at government. You know, by following these debates in the field, we can also be able to tell the competitive advantages and the challenges associated with letting any of these actors lead like development in this case, EdTech, the corruption surrounding, say, the argument against government intervention or government-led development, and then the private sector-led development, how it doesn't trickle down to the ordinary person, but it is to the interest of the private sector. Themes such as co-delivery, top and bottom-up approaches are coming up, access and utilization and sustainability. And with regards to utilization, I noted that we are focusing a lot on the technical competency of things, but then even if we look at certain interventions that have not gained support in the past, then you also start to ask, how do issues such as cultural issues surrounding, say, religion or traditional practices influence biases towards or for or against the use of technology. And even some of these biases themselves are things that we're dealing with in the age of technology, or they emerged in the age of technology itself. And these may be, I remember growing up when Facebook was so common, and now I see my cousins who are like 10 years old, their parents telling them, oh, you cannot use the internet, or use a different address to or a different profile, something that does not reflect you because your information can be stolen. How does this affect the data that are being used to make informative decisions and impactful decisions about the use of technology? Let me come back to the issue of turning many of these things we've talked about today into policy. Is there room to, realistically turn some of these into policy? We have actually touched on policies and programs. We have actually touched on the colonial undertones and then the Eurocentric undertones of some of these technologies. And when we talk about inequality in accessibility or utilization, then this also raises the question of, or let me give you a typical example, wherein in Ghana, I saw not too long ago, actually right before COVID, there were videos trending that made the news, how teachers are using chalk to teach children about a part of a computer, for example, on a blackboard. Like students, some of these people have never used that. So if you look at students in primary school or elementary school and how they cannot even access it, some of the recommendations we're talking about with respect to equity and inclusion, how do we turn them? So it's in this particular region, perhaps it's not just the older generation that cannot really use the infrastructure, but also the younger generation for which it is primarily targeted. How do we really turn it into to catch up? And then do we give it a timeline or a time scale for ensuring the sustainable inclusion of these people and then the next generation to come into the use of technology? And finally, local adaptations. Some of these technologies have been really designed in a very innocuous, good way, but then they go to the local level and maybe they may be adapted in a way that can actually change their true or original goal, or they may be used in a different way. So I think these are some of the things we can be thinking about as time goes on. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Cristobal, you get the last insight.
We're hitting the half hour, so I have to be quick, I guess. Hi, everybody. This is Cristobal Co. I'm a senior education specialist at the World Bank. Very pleased to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And most of the work that we do is to provide support to government. So I would love to stop for a moment on the idea of connecting access with governance, which I think is an opportunity to broadening what is understood by access, which is not only having access to devices and connectivity, but the capacities of governments to effectively integrate technology. I think it's good to remember that 3 billion human beings haven't used the internet ever in their lives. So when we think about the negative implications of technology, I think it's important to put that into context to which part of the global population are we referring to. I like when the report shed light in the idea of navigating between technophiles and techno-skeptics. I think we can be smart skeptics. I mean, we can be open to the opportunities of technology without neglecting some of the challenges that it brings. There are certainly cultural artifacts, and I think the conversations that we're having in this much more academic community would be very different to the ones that we'll find when we discuss with policymakers, and I don't think any of those are particularly good or bad. Now, technologies are hardly neutral, as I think has been described, not only in terms of exacerbating inequalities, but also they are tools to decentralize knowledge in ways that not always lead to the directions that we want. And I think that really generates a lot of conflict of interest. And the question I have is, to what extent governments, they have the institutional capacities to liaise and navigate these tensions. So that really leads us to the idea of understanding a broader approach to access, because access is a moving target, and what happened with access in an affluent region, it will be completely different discussion what the access is going to happen in environments where there are very limited access to electricity. So one of the concerns we have is the institutional capacities of governments are always well prepared to navigate these conflicts in terms of providing the right support to monitor when possible, or to train the teachers in the long run, but also protect people with some of the risks that my colleagues have mentioned in the past, and also having a long-term transformation in the systems, since we understand that if we only focus on technology, if we start the conversation with technology, we are certainly missing the point. We always encourage to start asking why you want to integrate technology before rushing to find the quick gadget or tool. And in terms of access and institutional capacities and governance, I believe that we have a massive inequality in terms of providing the right evidence of see what is happening and what is not happening with technology. I mean, the pandemic has been a disaster in terms of seeing how many kids have been out of the school. And the true recent results and technology integrations have been shown are certainly modest, if not disappointing in many cases. And we have learned that technology can hardly replace human connection in many, many cases. So the question is, are governments ready to integrate the technology effectively? I would love to see that as part of the discussion in the report. Thank you. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Crystal. And I'm going to give you the final chance, just see if you want to add anything in the last couple minutes.
I would like really to thanks once again for this comment, which suggests how complex is this topic. And for the first, for the comments by Patrick, I would say that all very, very, very relevant, especially about on the access, utilization and sustainability. And I would say that we would look into these issues, especially for the sustainability issue beyond access. And I think a word that is key also here is the context, which is really matters, as many of you have already highlighted. And we will try to really embed in all the chapter, because there is also the issue of local adaptability of and how this is taken into account, how the local relevance of education also is impacted positively or negative by technology, and then issues of corruptions related to governance and other negative facts are also being addressed already. Now, the latest question, I think really the issue of technology integration is something that is fundamental, and the effective technology integration. And we plan to have a careful look at it, because as you said, the COVID has revealed that is not just enough to have technologies, but is how countries set up and make this available to everyone that is really important, while addressing the negative impacts of technology. And as you said, access is really an important word, and access goes beyond access to or connectivity. We talk also about access to electricity. We talk about ministries or sectors that speak one to each other. We had the consultation with policymakers and officers of Ministry of Education, Ministry of Infrastructure, that say often we know that technology is there, but we don't speak to each other. So I think that this is also an important issue in terms of the capacity of government to monitor how technology is integrated effectively and how the different sectors or the different partners talk to each other and how they monitor what happens really in the schools and to the students. So all this, at this point, I can say that we are working on that, and we will be really happy to have all the materials that you can send to us. And I think Laura has shared the address, and will too. So everything that you can say, you think can be useful for this report, please share it, and we will be very glad to take a look and of course take into account. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anna. I want to close this out here first by thanking Manos and Anna and the rest of the GEM report team for sharing the concept note and being open to these types of consultations. So really appreciate the opportunity to input into the report at this important time. I want to also thank our panelists and the rest of everyone in the audience for sharing their thoughts and resources with the GEM report team, and encourage you to continue the conversation. As Anna just mentioned, I think in the chat box, you'll see a link to other future consultations, so you can continue the conversation there on the online consultation, which is continuing. Share your resources and research either via email or on Twitter to everyone. You will be receiving a post-event email from us. We'll be creating a summary document on the notes of this and sharing that out with the blog and the recording, and we'll let you know when that's available in a post-event email. As this is recorded, if you do not want your contribution included in the public recording, please let us know by March 1st. So I think that is it for today. Really appreciate everybody joining us today for this consultation of the 2023 GEM report on technology and education. I hope you have a great rest of your day.